The EU has just signed its own verdict. Now the breakup of the EU has become inevitable. Today, the European Union is rapidly losing its former power in terms of economic and political influence on the world economy. And if not so long ago the disintegration of the countries of Europe seemed something fantastic, today they have already decided to go down this path themselves, because they no longer see any reason to remain united. Not so long ago, the Union of European States was held up as an example to the entire world community. And today the example of Hungary. Viktor Orban calls the modern EU an unsuccessful parody of the Soviet Union. The contradictions of EU countries, both in politics and in the social life of citizens, are to blame. They have gone nowhere, despite efforts to reformat everyone to the same standard and cash subsidies to underdeveloped EU members. Great Britain became the first country that decided to officially leave the friendly family of European countries in order to continue to pursue a policy independent from the Europeans. In the June 23, 2016 referendum, nearly 52% of UK citizens who voted were in favour of leaving the European Union. The European Parliament has realised that the former EU principles, which took into account the democratic order in its political manifestation, no longer fit the times. That is, the EU can no longer function on the same terms. It turned out that many EU countries were too free in their economic and political actions. So it was decided to put an end to it. Of course, not in the way I described above, but the conferences initiated in 2019 on the future of Europe pointed in every possible way to such an outcome. In 2022, after the start of multiple sanctions packages against Russia, it became difficult to hide the true purpose of the conference on the future of Europe, and interesting details of the forthcoming totalitarianism in the EU began to leak into the press every now and then. Thus, the European Union has seriously talked about its intention to abandon the principle of unanimous decision-making, replacing it with the principle of simple majority. That is, the countries of Europe were being deprived of the right of the century. It would seem to be quite logical, for the needs of the majority are more important than the needs of the minority. Except that the right of veto of the EU member states is, in fact, the only instrument capable of protecting their interests. And as the UK's experience has shown, even with the right to veto, its leaders have stopped seeing EU membership as any advantage for their country. And what would happen if the EU countries were prohibited by law from defending their interests? Everyone will jump out the window. And now you, as a member of the EU, are now obliged to pull down too, even knowing the unfortunate consequences for yourself. The abolition of veto rights for EU countries was strongly advocated by Beryl and Scholz, the main initiators of anti-Russian sanctions. Of course, you cannot just bluntly tell the EU residents that no one wants to take their interests into account. So it was smooth sailing. For example, Scholz talked about abolishing veto eligibility in a way that supposedly would help form a unified tax policy, while mentioning the importance of treaty making in a number of areas, including common foreign policy. Here, for example, are the media headlines. The EU needs a majority vote on foreign tax policy. Scholz. At the same time, all EU members were instructed to comply with the anti-Russian sanctions policy and not to block new sanctions packages, otherwise sanctions will follow against countries that have already disobeyed within the EU. Recently, the Financial Times, citing European officials, stated the end of further sanctions against Russia due to the fact that there are no more enterprises left in Russia, the imposition of sanctions against which can not greatly harm one or another member of the European Union. Well, what if we abolish the veto power only for stalwart EU members, sacrificing them to circumstances for the common good of the EU? Will you say that this is nonsense and civilized Europe would never take such a step? But EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell doesn't think so. Here are his words, and I quote, "European countries are too small to survive in a world of big states. China is a state, the US is a state, India is a state. But we're not the state. We are a club of states. So we need rules that allow us to act faster." End quote. In plain language, Borrell called most of the EU countries a flake that is nothing of the sort. It is only by uniting that they can be on par with nations like India. A greater insult to EU countries was hard to think of. But Borrell said as much. Many experts, including in the EU itself, did not believe in the imminent abolition of the veto right, the right to protect their own interests for EU countries. If that happens, it will be in the distant future and only with the unanimous consent of all EU countries, they thought. Even Borrell himself has previously stated that in order to abolish unanimous decision-making, a unanimous decision by all EU members is needed. I know it's difficult as everyone wants to keep the veto. Unanimous decision-making means veto power. Unanimous decision-making means that if we don't like it, we block it until we have something else. That would seem to be the end of it, as only 9 out of 27 countries have declared their desire to abolish the veto: Belgium, Finland, France, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Slovenia, Spain and France. All other countries were strongly opposed to it. Veto law is used everywhere. For example, Hungary has a contract with Rosatom to build the PAKJ-2 nuclear power plant by 2030, and Budapest has repeatedly threatened VETA's right to any sanctions against the Russian nuclear sector that would infringe on Hungary's interests. Hungary also blocked a joint statement by European Union countries on the issuance of an arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin by the ICC International Criminal Court unrecognized by Russia, China and the United States. Austria, for example, retains its veto over the extension of the Schengen area to Bulgaria and Romania until there is a steady decline in the number of asylum seekers in those countries. Germany has begun to form a special group of friends of Germany within the EU to counter Poland's attacks on its sovereignty. And recently, through that very same majority, EU deputies voted in favor of the need to reform the EU through major changes to the Treaty on European Union. 291 votes to break up the EU, 274 versus. The Treaty A90337-2023 does not merely amend all or any of the EU rules, but makes major changes, one of which is precisely the need to abolish the veto right. In the fourth paragraph of the chapter on institutional reforms, it is already written without any ambiguity, and I quote, "To strengthen the Union's decision-making capacity in a significant number of areas, a qualified majority vote through the ordinary legislative procedure is required." The document itself provides for the discussion of 44 issues in different areas of EU law. Taking into account the position promoted by the main EU members, it is not difficult to guess the ultimate goal of the so-called start of discussions on a plan to reform the EU political order. Yes, they themselves have been talking all year long about the need to pass all laws and regulations by majority vote. The UK foresaw such a development back in 2014, immediately after the first anti-Russian sanctions were imposed. So she began preparations for a referendum on leaving the European Union. And no further rallies of dissenters scaring residents with all the consequences of Brexit and numerous postponements of the UK's exit from the EU prevented her from saying goodbye to the EU. After such profound changes in the EU, Moscow also made certain conclusions, initiating its withdrawal from all possible international treaties of the Council of Europe. On February 22, 2023, Vladimir Putin signed a federal law on the termination of international treaties of the Council of Europe with respect to the Russian Federation. Scholz has repeatedly stated, where unanimity is required today, there is a great risk that a single country will use its veto power and prevent the others from moving forward. And that risk increases with each new member state. That reminds me of something. No, it's not what you think. It's only a resignation ceremony for Federal Chancellor Angela Merkel, but it looks like something similar. It's possible. The breakup of the EU will really benefit countries such as Germany and France, because it will be possible to restart the association in a new format, with new treaties. And the most important thing is to customize everything initially. However, such a scenario of softly forcing countries to leave the European Union on their own is unlikely. Changes in the current world order dictate other priorities. For example, French President Macron is already asking for meetings of the BRICS countries, because he understands what the new world order will be like. You can call it whatever you want, the same democratic totalitarianism. In any case, the discussion started in the EU on building a new political regime, which implies absolute control of some states over all aspects of life of other states, with time resulting through majority voting, will end either with the latter's withdrawal from the EU, or it already happened in the mid-1930s in Europe, and how it ended is also known. So what's the point? Is Viktor Orban wrong to call the modern EU an unsuccessful parody of the Soviet Union?